If I were to ask you the simplest math problem, what would you say it is? Well, yes and no. 1 plus 1 equals 2. And if I were to ask you to prove it, you'd probably do something like take one orange and add a second orange, and you'd say, look, there's 2 oranges. I proved 1 plus 1 is 2. But apparently it's not that simple if you want to prove it mathematically. In the early part of the 1900s, Bertrand Russell, a British mathematician and philosopher, set out to prove mathematics in general. I thought about, what if he'd disproven it? What if he'd shown, no, it really doesn't work? What would that do to everything through all the years we've been using math? But he set out to prove, he didn't really doubt it, but he said, it's not been proven. And so to begin that, he started with the simplest math equation, 1 plus 1 equals 2. And he set out to prove it mathematically. And that little formula, the stuff you see in the upper right-hand part of your handout, that is part of the mathematical proof for 1 plus 1 equals 2.
What's the point?
Well, a lot of people were overwhelmed by that. What a work of genius that he's done this. And here's the thing. It's a part. It's an incredibly small part. It took him 372 pages of mathematics like that to prove that 1 plus 1 equals 2. And the good thing is he did it. Well, yeah, I know. Maybe that's it. A good mathematician could have done it in 2 steps. I don't know. But again, in the world of mathematics, this was hailed as a breakthrough, an accomplishment. But like I say, it looks so foreign to us. 1 plus 1 equals 2. That seems so simple. Well, I share that. I looked for an illustration like this because in Matthew 24, the disciples ask what seems like a simple question, as easy as what's 1 plus 1? And Jesus gives an answer that throughout the years has been about as complicated as what you see on the handout there, the top right corner. His answer has been disputed and debated, and it still is today. What Jesus mean? What was he talking about? And we're going to look at some of those things, and I'm going to give you some ideas of what I think he's saying, what it means. But as I read through this chapter, what really struck me is with all the things that are uncertain and disputed and open to interpretation, there is one thing that is clear, or at least should be clear. Unfortunately, maybe it's not as clear as it should be, but the clear thing in this, when you really look at it, especially in its context, is you see that Jesus, in the midst of all this, is continuing this theme that started early on in Matthew, this focus on the spiritual over the physical. That Jesus' purpose is to set up a spiritual kingdom, not a physical kingdom, that our relationship to that kingdom, our discipleship in that kingdom is spiritual based, not physical based. Again, all the way back to the beginning of Matthew, when the Magi came to worship, they had this spiritual focus, and you see the Jewish leaders, they weren't interested. Why? Because it didn't fit their physical priorities at the time. He's just a baby. Well, maybe get with him when he can do something. And then definitely the last few chapters that we've been seeing as we talk about, how do I know whose expectations I'm living by? What if can you miss the purpose? And we see that you can miss God's purpose. There's no excuse for it, but it happens. And, can I handle the truth? It all has to do with what perspective am I coming from? Am I looking at the world through a spiritual perspective or a physical perspective? And Jesus is continuing that same thought here. And what I want us to see, the main idea today, is to the degree we misunderstand the spiritual nature of the kingdom, we miss the kingdom. And they're proportionate. Some people were looking here in Jesus' audience, they totally misunderstood it, and they weren't going to be in the kingdom at all. But even to the degree we misunderstand it, if we focus too much on the physical, we're going to miss the abundance of the kingdom life that Jesus wants us to have. And so we're going to look at it, and again, we're going to look at the details and talk about them a little bit, but I want to see what the real important thing is at the end. So start there, Matthew 24, verse 1. Jesus left the temple and was walking away when his disciples came up to him to call his attention to its buildings. Now, it doesn't say what they were saying here in Matthew. I assume Matthew probably thought his readers, the Jewish readers, would know. Mark adds some details. They talk about how magnificent it was, how massive the stones and all this. Again, the Jews would know that the temple was impressive. This was the second temple, really. Solomon had built the first temple. It was destroyed by the Babylonians, and then it was rebuilt when the Jews came back by Zerubbabel. But then Herod had started, not a rebuilding, it was still that temple, but a renovation. He had expanded it. He made the base wider. He made the walls higher. And it was impressive. It definitely was. And that's what they're saying. They're looking at these buildings. They're marveling like, Jesus, wow, look at that. Jesus says in verse 2, do you see all these things? Truly I tell you, not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down. Well, as Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. Tell us, they said, when will this happen, and what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age? Now, that's the major question, and everything revolves around it. And one thing most people agree on is that the disciples didn't, we look at this and we see two separate questions. When will this happen? In other words, the destruction of the temple. And then what will be the sign of your coming and the end of the age, Jesus' second coming? And, for us, we know they're two separate things. The disciples didn't know that. They didn't know it was going to be, they didn't know he was going to leave. So they definitely didn't have this idea, when you come back 2,000, 3,000 years. No, they didn't have that in mind. And really that word coming can be appearance. And so they think when this temple happens, it's going to be a sign of Jesus. Not so much he's left and he's coming back, but to make an appearance. They really made an appearance. The emphasis isn't on, they weren't here and they are here. It's like, just look how they appeared. Look how they came in. Well, Jesus is going to come with such power. It's going to usher in the end of the age, and it's all going to be tied together in their mind. Now, Jesus doesn't answer the question that way. And there's many times where Jesus knows the people he's talking to, you don't get this yet, but eventually you will. And so he answers a question differently than they ask it. And as people today break that down and throughout the years, the usual approach is that Jesus starts talking about the destruction of Jerusalem, and then at some point in the chapter, he switches. And he starts talking about his second coming. Again, even though they didn't understand that they were going to be separate, he talks about it, and looking back, we can see it. And it varies where those breaks happen. Sometimes you can tell by the headings in your Bible where the people who wrote the Bible translated that one in that particular version where they think it breaks. But a lot of people would say it breaks at verse 36. Up till verse 36, Jesus is talking about the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple. And the reason they do that is because everything before verse 36, he talks about in those days. And then verse 36, he says, but in that day. And so a lot of people say that's where the break happens. Other people put it at different places in the chapter. There are some that say the entire chapter is about one event or the other. There are some, they would be the people who support the left behind view, the premillennial view, that would say the entire chapter is about the second coming. It's a little hard. One section definitely seems to talk about Jerusalem, but they apply everything. There's others who say the entire chapter is about Jerusalem and doesn't mention the second coming. And that actually is a little easier to view it that way, especially when you take Luke into account, that maybe the whole thing is about that. And I told you, I think some of you, that I've changed my mind after I was studying for this. I used to take that approach that the break is very late. If it's there at all, the whole thing may be about Jerusalem. But now, again, I read something that makes sense. I think what Jesus is talking about is he's talking about the entire church age. So he's not just talking about definitely Jerusalem. He's not just talking about the events right before the second coming. He's talking about everything from the time he leaves until the time he comes back. And then there's definitely one section in there, a group of verses that focus on Jerusalem. So let's look at that with that in mind. Jesus answered, watch out that no one deceives you. For many will come in my name, claiming I am the Messiah, and will deceive many. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these things are the beginning of birth pains. Now, the focus of this first part almost seems to be more on what things are not signs versus what are. He says, these are not signs that I'm going to be coming any second, that I'm going to be there the next day. These are things that are going to happen the entire time from when I leave until I come back. During that entire time, these are signs of the end in one sense, but not how near it is. These are things that are going to happen, but it doesn't mean I'm coming tomorrow. And the key point is of this whole section, and we're going to see it more toward the end, is Jesus is saying, don't be deceived during or even by what appears to us to be a delay. and has appeared to Christians throughout the ages, even in Bible times. There are people before the Bible was even done being written said, Jesus, he's taking way too long. Well, obviously that's just continued for 2,000 years. And part of his focus here is to say, don't be deceived, don't be disturbed, don't be shaken in your faith because I'm taking longer than you expect. You know, and he warned specifically, there'll be people who come and claim, I am the Messiah. And that started, again, before the Bible was even finished being written. There are people saying, I'm the Messiah. He's saying, and they'd point to these, well, look at this war, you know, it's the end times, it's here, I'm the Messiah. He said, those are not signs to support a person's claim. Those are going to happen the whole time. When he goes on in verse 9, he says, then you will be handed over to be persecuted and put to death, and you will be hated by all nations because of me. At that time, many will turn away from the faith and will betray and hate each other, and many false prophets will appear and deceive many people. Because of the increase of wickedness, the love of most will grow cold. But the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. The first thing, that word then in verse 9 doesn't mean that, well, after everything in the previous verses happened, then this is going to happen. He's talking about during. You know, then also, while these wars and famines are going on, you're also going to be persecuted. You know, it's going to be both things at once, not one after the other. And again, history shows that. Christians were persecuted, you know, shortly after Jesus left. It began to happen. And so the entire time is going to be marked by this persecution. You know, verse 12, it talks about because of the increase of wickedness, the love of most will grow cold. Well, again, if you take this view, that he's talking about the start of the church to the end, he's really talking about throughout that whole time, wickedness is just going to increase and increase. And I think we look back and we say that's been true. You know, it doesn't mean that every single year, you know, maybe a little down, but in general, you know, it's been said that the 20th century was the bloodiest century in all of history. Wickedness has increased. And the warning there, the love of most will grow cold. Jesus said at the beginning, it's going to be, you know, wide is the gate that leads to destruction, narrow is the gate that leads to life. But as time goes on, it's going to be even worse, he says. Even less people will have love for God. Well, one verse that you may be familiar with, maybe you've heard it as people talk about the end times, verse 14. This gospel of the kingdom will be preached in the whole world as a testimony to all nations, and then the end will come. You ever heard anyone say, well, until the gospel gets to every single person, Jesus can't come back? You know, and they just found a tribe down in the Amazon or these people over, Jesus can't come back. Well, the problem with that is we take language the wrong way. We don't understand the nature of language. And we use language all the time in a certain way, but then we read the Bible like we don't do the same thing. And even what I just said, all the time. Again, no one stops to think, well, all the time, Steve, you mean literally all? You know, if you had a friend that said to you, hey, I worked all day yesterday, are you going to like press them and say, literally, you worked 24 hours? You worked 24 hours. Yeah, 24. Maybe they did. You know, some people, a long shift, 20, but all day. You never stopped to eat lunch? You didn't go to the bathroom?
Hey, that can be work for some.
Well, okay. But I think the point is becoming clear. Language isn't always meant to be taking, you know, it's whatever the intended meaning is. That's going to come true. Well, the Bible shows us what the intended meaning of this was, that the gospel was going to be preached in the whole world, because Colossians 1:23 says, this is the gospel that you heard and that has been proclaimed to every creature under heaven. Now, had every single person living heard it? No. But what it's saying, it has gone out into the known world, and it spread rapidly. Paul says something similar in 1:8. He says, your faith is being reported all over the world. Had every single person heard about the faith of the Romans? No, but he's saying it's gone out. So again, Colossians makes it clear. If that's what is required before Jesus can come back, well, he can come back ever since Colossians 1:23 was written. It's now that stipulation, that requirement's been met. So no longer, if you hear someone say, oh, it can't happen yet, it can. Verse 15, so when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. Then let those who are in Judea flee to the mountains. Let no one on the housetop go down to take anything out of the house. Let no one in the field go back to get their cloak. How dreadful it will be for those in those days for pregnant women and nursing mothers. Pray that your flight will not take place in winter or on the Sabbath, For then there will be great distress, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again. Now, did you notice a shift there? It sounds maybe a little different, a little more specific. This is the section that is focused on the destruction of Jerusalem. This is an answer to that question. He's saying, here's what's going to happen the whole time from my leaving to my coming back. But then in verse 15 and following, the focus is on the impending, and you notice in verse 21, the great distress. Prior to this, and it doesn't come through in the translation, but up in verse 9, he says, you will be handed over to be persecuted. A couple major translations say you'll be handed over for the tribulation. The word there is distress. And so he's making a contrast. There's going to be distress the entire time, but during this period where Jerusalem is under siege and destroyed, he's calling that the great distress. And certainly for his Jewish audience there, you can see why that for them would be the great distress. He references Daniel when he talks about, you will see standing in the holy place, the abomination that causes desolation. That phrase, abomination of desolation, occurs 4 times in Daniel. 2 of them, it's very clear, refer to something that happened between the testaments, after the close of the old, before the new, when the Syrians and Antiochus Epiphanes came in and conquered things, and he slaughtered a pig on the altar. That was the abomination of desolation that 2 of them refer to. But in Daniel 9 and Daniel 12, there's other mentions of it, and those definitely point further on. And it seems like that's what he's saying here. Accompanying this destruction of Jerusalem is going to be the abomination that causes desolation. And that's why he says, let the reader understand. In other words, the reader of Daniel, understand that what Daniel said is going to be coming about right here. Well, what is the fulfillment? What happened around this time that fulfilled this prophecy? And one thing that makes it difficult is the holy place is usually the temple. And the thing is, if by the time the Romans conquered Jerusalem and defiled the temple, it would be too late for the people to flee, which is the whole point of this section. You see what he's talking about? Fleeing, leaving, don't go down to the house, don't come back in. He's telling the people, and history shows, the Christians left Jerusalem before the Romans completely besieged it, and definitely before they conquered it. Christians escaped. Christian Jews, because they had the book of Matthew, because they had Jesus' warning. Obviously, Jews who didn't believe in Jesus didn't heed this, and so they're the ones who died in Jerusalem. But it seems like the thing that Jesus is warning, Luke 21 makes it a little more clear. It says, when you see Jerusalem being surrounded by armies, you will know that its desolation is near. And that seems to be the point. It's not wait till the Romans get in here, but when you see things coming, you know the Romans are going to conquer the city. You know what's going to happen to the temple. Get out. And history shows that when Rome came, it wasn't in one solid stage. That they started and it didn't stop. It came, one battle was they were repelled, came back. There were some changes in Rome, and this happened and that. The Christians got out. After things started, before the final destruction, Christians got out because they heeded this warning. And that's what Jesus is saying when he talks about fleeing. You look at verse 17. He says there, let no one on the housetop go down to take anything out of the house. The houses were flat. And he's basically saying, run along the roofs of the house to get out. Now, I don't know if that's to be taken literally, because they didn't have just seconds when they saw Rome there and then Rome backed off. They would have had a little while. But what he's saying is don't wait. Don't think, well, things are going to be okay. Things are going to work out. I'll wait till later. He said, no, when you see it coming, it's the time to leave. Even if there's a nursing mother, even if it's in winter. He says, woe if it's on the Sabbath. Because the Jews who didn't follow Christianity, they're going to persecute you somewhat if you're trying to take a long trip on the Sabbath, if you're carrying things on the Sabbath. And maybe at this point the Jewish Christians still held on to some of those. It makes some of them uncomfortable to travel so far on the Sabbath. But Jesus says when you see it coming, get out. And that's what they did. Again, it saved their life. Verse 21, it says, for then there will be great distress, unequaled from the beginning of the world until now, and never to be equaled again. Josephus, which there was a show on TV recently that had Josephus as a figure. He was a real Jewish figure. He was captured, became sort of the Roman historian, of the Roman Jewish wars. And he records how bad things got in Jerusalem. That because of the siege, there was famine, there was disease. It was a horrific time. There was savagery. Mothers would eat their own children. That's how bad things were in Jerusalem. He says, it's never seen it this bad. It'll never be this bad. Now, there's other, higher death tolls. But again, for God's people there in the city of Jerusalem, it was the worst that had happened. And so that's what he's talking about there. This section talks about the stones not being left on top of each other, that part of the disciples' question. Well, then verse 22, if those days had not been cut short, no one would survive, but for the sake of the elect, those days will be shortened. A lot of people take that to mean those days Jerusalem. But I used to think that too. It's still talking about the temple. I don't think so. I think he's going back now to talk about the entire Christian age, which he's just said the wickedness is going to increase. He said if this whole time before Jesus came back, if God doesn't shorten it, it's going to get so bad that no one would survive. And when he says no one there, again, the word means it seems to apply bigger than just in Jerusalem. You know, it's all flesh, and the elect is, all believers, not just the ones in Jerusalem. And matter of fact, it's the ones in Jerusalem got out. The Christians, the believers, they left Jerusalem. And the siege in Jerusalem, it wasn't shortened. It went through to the end. It's going back and talking about the Christian age and the persecution and the wars that are going to happen. Saying, if God didn't call a stop to it at some point, it would get so bad, everything would be wiped out. At that time, if anyone says to you, look, here's the Messiah, or there he is, do not believe him. For false messiahs and false prophets will appear and perform great signs and wonders to deceive, if possible, even the elect, which the elect refers to believers, to Christians. See, I have told you ahead of time. In other words, Jesus says, I'm prophesying this. When it comes true, it'll be a sign of encouragement to know God knew what he was talking about. It's happening just the way he said. So if anyone tells you, there he is, the Messiah, out in the wilderness, do not go out. Or here he is in the inner rooms, do not believe it. For as lightning comes from the east, that is visible even in the west, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. Wherever there is a carcass, there the vultures will gather. What he's saying is, his coming won't be a secret. If someone has to tell you, hey, the Messiah has come, he hasn't come. Because when he comes, no one will have to tell you. Everyone will know. It will be as clear. He says, as lightning flashes in one part, you'll see it, over in the west. It'll be as clear as when and it's not sure what that parable with the vultures means. When you see the vultures, there's a carcass, or the vultures, when they never miss a carcass. Whatever it is, it's just the certainty there. You will know for sure. No one will have to tell you. There'll be no secret return of the Messiah. And throughout history, there have been some claims of different groups and cults. Oh, the Messiah came back, and it was secret. He didn't tell you. Only a few of us know. Jesus warned about this right here. He said, don't believe it. I was reading one author, and he talked about, warning people not to believe these things. This author said, empty-headed credulity is as great an enemy of true faith as chronic skepticism. Chronic skepticism is the people say, oh, I don't believe it. You tell them the fact, you give them the, oh, I don't believe it, I don't believe it. That's an enemy of true faith. They're not going to come to faith. But he says, you know what? Empty-headed credulity, believing everything you hear, that's as big of an enemy of faith. You're going to miss the true faith if you believe everything you hear. Don't believe it. Test it against what Jesus says, what the Bible says. And then verse 29, immediately after the distress of those days, the sun will be darkened, and the moon will not give light. The stars will fall from the sky, and the heavenly bodies will be shaken. Then will appear the sign of the Son of Man in heaven, and then all the peoples of the earth will mourn when they see the Son of Man coming on the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. And he will send his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather from his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heavens to the other. Now, it starts off immediately after the distress of those days. So he's going back to, again, the distress of verse 9, which is the entire Christian age. He's not talking about Jerusalem anymore. Again, he's shifted from that. But what he's saying, immediately after all this general war and famine and persecution, that distress that's going to characterize the entire Christian age, then this is going to happen. And there were, some people still apply this to the year 70, and there were some strange events that happened to the destruction, around the destruction of Jerusalem. But the big key that he's talking about the end times is verse 31. It says, he will send his angels with a loud trumpet call, and they will gather his elect from the four winds, from one end of the heavens to the other. That's talking about Jesus returning and taking all the believers, gathering them, from the world, as well as all the other peoples seeing him, because that's why the other peoples of earth are going to mourn. They're going to realize Jesus is real, it is true, and we didn't believe. Also, what's the sign of the Son of Man in verse 30? And again, a couple of possibilities. One of them is that word sign can mean standard or banner, and it seems to be saying that along with the audible signal and sign of Jesus coming, the trumpet call, there's going to be something visible. A banner, a stand, something that we see visibly as well as hear, Jesus is back. The other alternative is the sign of the Son of Man just is the Son of Man. He is the sign, and we'll see him. So either way, we'll see Jesus, we'll see an indication of Jesus, we'll hear a trumpet call when he's actually returning at the end of this distress period, which again started as soon as he left and has been continuing ever since. Verse 32, now learn this lesson from the fig tree. As soon as its twigs get tender and its leaves come out, you know that summer is near. Even so, when you see all these things, you know that it is near, right at the door. That Greek word can be translated it or he, and a couple major translations have he. So whether it, the end, or he, Jesus, you'll know he's near, right at the door. Truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. So he had just talked about previously the end of time, when he comes back at the end of the church age. I think now he's going back again. He's just sort of summarizing. This is back the entire church age. That's what he means by all these things. When you see all these things, you'll know that he is near, right at the door. The thing to realize there, when it talks about near, right at the door, it doesn't mean he's just about to walk in necessarily, because, again, these things have been happening for 2,000 years. What it means is the next step in God's plan is this. There's nothing, when these things happen, from that point on, and literally from the time Jerusalem was destroyed, Jesus can come back at any instant. There's nothing else. There's no other step in the middle is what it's saying. He's right outside the door. Have you ever been outside a door and didn't go in right away? That's what's happening. He's there. He can come in at any time. It just might be a while. There's no other step we're waiting for. But it doesn't mean he's coming tomorrow, is basically what that's saying. It's the next major step in God's plan. Now, one verse that often comes up, verse 34, truly I tell you, this generation will certainly not pass away until all these things have happened. And that's caused some problem. And I used to wonder, the people who talk, well, this is all about the end times. How can it be this generation? And they try to twist it and well, it's the generation that lives right before Jesus comes back. They won't pass away. Well, of course that, but he's talking to these people. That's what it means. You, the people I'm talking to, you won't die until these things have happened. Well, again, if you take it to mean the second coming, those people aren't still alive. But it doesn't have to mean that when you take this view of the things I've told you about. One is the destruction of Jerusalem. But the rest of it is persecution, wars, and famines are going to start. It doesn't say they're going to end and Jesus is going to come back. All these things I've told you. There's going to be wars, there's going to be famine, there's going to be persecution, and Jerusalem's going to be destroyed. All those things happened in the life of that generation. They're still happening now, the wars and famines and persecution, but all those things happened. That's what he means. This will start by the time before you living and listening to me before you die. This war, the famines will start, and Jerusalem will be destroyed. And that happened. Jesus is talking around the year 30. Jerusalem was destroyed in the year 70. So 40 years after he talked about a generation, Jerusalem was destroyed. All these things had happened. And in verse 35, heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. Jesus begins to shift. He's giving them reassurance. Realize you can count on this, and the reason he's giving this reassurance is what he's going to focus on next, in light of what to us at times and people throughout history has looked like a delay. It's like, what's taking you so long, Jesus? He says, realize heaven and earth will pass away, but my words will never pass away. You can count on this however long it takes. And then verse 36, that's where he begins talking about it. But about that day or hour no one knows, not even the angels in heaven nor the Son of Man, but only the Father. As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. For in the days before the flood, people were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, up to the day Noah entered the ark. And they knew nothing about what would happen until the flood came and took them all away. This is how it will be at the coming of the Son of Man. What Jesus is saying here is, I've told you these things are going to happen after I leave and until I come back. But you don't know, and you will never know exactly when I'm going to come back. There's going to be wars, there's going to be famine, there's going to be persecution. Well, you know what? That's been happening for 2,000 years. He's saying, in the one sense, I'm telling you what's going to happen before I come back, but don't think you'll be able to pinpoint and say, oh, this war means he's coming back right now. This number 7 and 7 and seventh Sabbath and whatever's going on with John Hagee now and different things, and this one means no. I mean, that one verse, how can you ignore that? But about that day or hour, no one knows. Not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son. He says, at this point, I don't even know when it's happening. When Jesus came to earth, he didn't have the omniscience that he had as God. At this point, he says, I don't even know. How can people today say, I know? Well, Jesus is going to come back. How in the world can you say that? That's his whole point. He said, just like the time of Noah, people were going on their daily lives. The flood came unexpectedly. Now, Noah had been telling them. It wasn't unexpected in that sense, but it wasn't like there were a few drops, a little mini flood, and that gave them a while to think about it. And when it started, it started. And he's saying the same thing. There won't be any indication that you've known, okay, after 2,000 years, 2,500, he's coming tomorrow. He's coming next month. There will be nothing like that. You aren't going to know. And again, from the destruction of Jerusalem on, he could have come, and he can come any second. There's nothing else we're waiting for. There's nothing else that will signal it and we'll say, oh, this is it. 2 men will be in the field. One will be taken and the other left. 2 women will be grinding with a handmill. One will be taken and the other left. These verses are what gave rise to the Left Behind. That's the title, Left Behind. The whole premillennial view and the rapture. Jesus is going to come back. He's not going to touch down, so this isn't really the second coming. He's going to take all the believers out of the world, and then I don't know all the details. It's not my view that I personally hold. And I'm not, again, when it comes to the end times, I'm not saying for sure which one's right. But here's the problem with that. This verse in its context is just talking about the distinction. When Jesus does come back, when it does end, there'll be 2 people that have been side by side. One of them is going to be taken, the other is going to be left. One of them is going to be saved, the other is not going to be saved. It's not taken out of the world. It's just one's going to be saved, one won't be saved at the judgment. And you know what else? It doesn't even say taken for what. Are they going to be taken to heaven, or are they going to be taken for judgment? Because he's been talking about both of them. So it doesn't even tell who's going to, that's his point. Not they're going to be taken out of the world secretly and the whole clothes folded on the seats thing. I personally don't see that. He's just saying when Jesus comes, these 2 people. And he's going to go on then to tell, here's the basis of what will determine if one is taken or left. If one, again, whatever taken and left means. If one of them goes to heaven and one of them doesn't, he's going to go on to tell, here's the basis for that. Here's how you'll know if you can determine. I want to be the one that goes with Jesus, not the one who's not with Jesus. Verse 42. Thank you. Wow, those numbers keep getting smaller. Therefore, keep watch, because you do not know on what day your Lord will come. You don't know. But understand this, and really the tense of the Greek can be not just like understand something you don't know. He says, but you know this, because what he's going to say is obvious. If the owner of the house had known what time of night the thief was coming, he would have kept watch and would not have let his house be broken into. Does that make sense? Thieves don't announce, I'll be there at, 1:03. It wouldn't be good for their health with a lot of people. So, they don't do that. The owner would be ready. And what's also interesting, Jesus in this parable is the thief. So it shows you can't take the details of parables and stretch them too far. So the thief, the owner would be ready. So you also must be ready, because the Son of Man will come at an hour when you do not expect him. And you won't know. You'll know, here's what's going to happen after he leaves. But again, that's been going on for 2,000 years. You won't know exactly when he's coming. This is the first of 5 parables that go into the next chapter. The theme of all of them is this idea of be ready, watchfulness. But one thing that becomes clear is it's not this passive. It's not just sit around and wait for Jesus. There's things you need to do to be ready. There's things that includes and entails. Again, for this owner of the house, it's keep watch. He goes on the last section of verses here, 45. He says, who then is the faithful and wise servant, whom the master has put in charge of the servants in his household to give them their food at the proper time? It will be good for that servant whose master finds him doing so when he returns. Truly, I tell you, he will put him in charge of all his possessions. But suppose that servant is wicked and says to himself, my master is staying away a long time, and then he begins to beat his fellow servants and to eat and drink with drunkards. The master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour he is not aware of. He will cut him to pieces and assign him a place with the hypocrites, where there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Talking about eternal judgment there. These verses here are the culmination. You should have noticed in verse 42, what's the key word there? Therefore. Whenever you see therefore, see what it's there for. He's saying, in light of everything I've just said up to this, therefore, Here's the application. Here's what you need to do. All the details I've told you, they're sort of interesting. Here's what's going to happen. Here's what you need to do. And so let's look at that. As I was going over this myself, and especially the first time I just read through it on my own and took notes, I'm like, okay, I'm not really sure. What is clear? And that's always a good approach to studying a passage of the Bible. What do I know? And so here's some things that are clear, both from the text and from history, from experience. And you don't base your theology on experience, but definitely your experience should line up with your theology, or your theology might not be true. And so history shows us as well. First of all, there will be wars and natural disasters during the entire church age. That's what this is saying. This chapter is not just about the end times right before Jesus comes. Again, it is about the end times, but realize we've been living in the end times since Jerusalem was destroyed. Everything since then is the end times. These things are really to be expected if you think about it, because the kingdom, it's already but not yet. It's not been fully realized. And so we should expect there's going to be evil in the world. We should even expect there's going to be natural disasters. Romans, I didn't put it on the handout, because I had a lot of verses there, but Romans says in chapter 8, "For the creation was subjected to frustration, not by its own choice, but by the will of the one who subjected it, in hope that the creation itself will be liberated from its bondage to decay and brought into the freedom and glory of the children of God." That's talking about natural disasters. God didn't create a world and say, I want there to be earthquakes and floods and tornadoes. They're part of sin. You realize that the sin affected the very natural disasters we have. They're a part of that. And he's saying, when Jesus comes back, there's not going to be those things in the new heavens and new earth. Second, what is clear, again, that verse was Romans 8:20-21, if you want to look that up. Second thing, Christians will be hated and persecuted, again, during the entire church age, and that's definitely been shown. We see it in the Bible, we see it in history with Rome, and all throughout the time up until now. And it's promised in other places. In Matthew, Jesus said, "You will be hated by everyone because of me." Timothy says, "Everyone who wants to live a godly life in Christ Jesus will be persecuted." Again, we don't like to hear that. There's a distinction between what I like and what's true. I don't like that, but it's true. Christians are going to be hated and persecuted, and as Jesus said in one point, it's only going to get worse. Next, people will try to deceive Christians. Said that in the text. Said there's going to be false messiahs. Also said there's going to be false prophets. Other parts in the Bible warn about this. 2 Peter said, "But there were also false prophets among the people." That's looking back to the Old Testament. "Just as there will be false teachers among you," among Christians. "They will secretly introduce destructive heresies, even denying the sovereign Lord who bought them, bringing swift destruction on themselves." And we don't know what that means. It doesn't mean they're instantly struck dead, but there will be a consequence. "Many, though, will follow their depraved conduct and will bring the way of truth," Christianity, "into disrepute." 1 John 4:1 says, "Dear friends, do not believe every spirit, but test the spirits to see whether they are from God, because many false prophets have gone out into the world." And when you use a spirit there, it's not talking about some apparition that's going to come and talk to you. It's talking about the spirit, the overall character. That person has a good spirit. It's talking about, test a person. What they say, what they do by the Bible. Don't just assume, someone says, oh, this is what God says, this is what the Bible means, that it's true. Check it out for yourself, because there will be false prophets, it's saying. That's true the entire church age. Next, Jesus' return will be clear, but not necessarily soon. When he comes, we will all know it. No one will have to tell you, oh, he came yesterday. Go over here, you'll find him. It will be clear, but not necessarily soon, is what he's saying here, and definitely the Bible echoes this. 2 Peter 3, Peter says, "Above all, you must understand that in the last days," when are the last days? Now, every time since Jerusalem fell in the 70. "Scoffers will come, scoffing and following their own evil desires. They will say, 'Where is this coming he promised?'" See, this is back when Peter's writing. They're saying, "Where is he?" But do not forget this one thing, dear friends. With the Lord, a day is like 1,000 years, and 1,000 years are like a day. The Lord is not slow in keeping his promise, as some understand slowness. Again, I put delay in parentheses when I say it. He's not delayed. There's nothing that's thrown off his plan. To us, it may seem that way because it's been so long, but his plan is going on just the way he intended. And the point of all of this, the thing that we really need to get from this is be prepared. That's what these parables that we saw two of them today, we're going to look at more of them next week. That's the theme of all of them. You need to be prepared. What's it mean to be prepared? Well, you look at these parables and it's whatever fits the situation. The owner of the house, there's a potential for a thief to come. Well, it means he needs to keep watch because he doesn't know when the thief is going to come. This wicked servant, he should be prepared by following the instructions of his master, taking care of the other servants that are in his charge. The wicked servant didn't. He beats them. He goes out on his own. Well, for us, what's it mean to be prepared? What's our situation? What are our instructions? And we've been seeing all throughout Matthew, to be prepared means to be committed. It means to make a commitment to God, to have faith, not just belief that it's true, and not just actions. Actions are the sign of commitment, but they're not the focus. Oh, I did this, this, and this. All right, where's your heart? Are you committed? Do you have true faith? That's what he's looking for. Again, not perfect commitment even. We'll never be perfect, but we can't have some area of our life that we say, God, that's off limits. I'm not going to listen to you here. I don't like what you say, and so I'm not going to do it. We have to be wholly committed, have to have true faith. That's what it means to be prepared. And the last thing here on that note, as I looked at it, it struck me that in Jesus saying this, there's a church-wide focus and a church-wide element to this being prepared. Because it says in verse 13, the one who stands firm to the end will be saved. Well, think of it. No one yet has ever stood firm till the end. If the end is the second coming, no one has stood firm till the end. I've stood firm to the end of my life, okay, but he seems to be talking about something bigger. This delay that Jesus has taken so long, yeah, that's right, but he's not, people live a certain amount of time. We're not saying it's taken so long because, it's been 48 years. Not 48? Yeah, thank you. I'm saying it's been so long because it's been 2,000 years. I'm looking at the whole thing. And so what I'm saying is there's an application here for the entire church, for the church as a whole. Don't let the time, the length of time from Jesus leaving till he comes back. Church, don't drift from his teachings. Don't drift from the truth as a whole. Not just people and their commitment goes up and down. The church as a whole and where we stand and our understanding of what God wants. And the Bible warns about this too, 2 Timothy. It says, Paul is giving a charge, an encouragement to Timothy. He says, preach the word, be prepared in season and out of season. Correct, rebuke, and encourage with great patience and careful instruction. As a preacher, that's what you need to do. Then look what he says in verse 3, for the time will come when people will not put up with sound doctrine. Instead, to suit their own desires, they will gather around them a great number of teachers to say what their itching ears want to hear. And he's warning Timothy of that, again, 2,000 years ago. But it's going to happen the entire church age. And again, it's not a steady climb, up, down, back and forth, one part of the world, not another part. But I tell you, our 21st century American church, this is something to think about. I had this sermon in mind, and I was made aware of a Facebook post yesterday that said, share if you love God. In 120 seconds, he will do you a favor. At first I thought it said share in 120 seconds and he'll do you a favor, and that was already bad. But the 120 seconds is that, don't put this off, do it right now, and God will do you a favor. No, it's not even that. It's share, and God's going to do you a favor within 2 minutes. If that doesn't just, characterize Western Christianity, I don't know what does. I can share something on Facebook, and God is obligated to do me a favor. But it's share if you love God. So it's all about me loving God. Well, of course, I'd love anyone who would do me a favor in 2 minutes if I share their post on Facebook. I'll love any one of you if you do that. Make the deal. What a religion. You just keep clicking that mouse. Come on. But, the phrase, a great number of teachers to say what their itching ears want to hear. Wouldn't you like that? I'd love it if that were true. But it's not. Come on, that's not God. It makes me God and him the bellhop. Our itching ears. The church as a whole needs to be careful too. And, What's the root problem? We always come back to this, and it comes down, again, he's warning us, be prepared, be committed. Well, what's the root problem? Why wouldn't a Christian be prepared? Why wouldn't I be committed? I've read the Bible, I see this, I know what I'm supposed to do. I think the root problem, it starts just where this whole chapter started. Verse 1, Jesus left the temple and was walking away when his disciples came up to him to call his attention to its buildings. Do you see all these things, he asked? Truly I tell you, not one stone here will be left on another. Everyone will be thrown down. When the disciples said that to Jesus, look at these buildings, where was their focus? Physical. Look at these impressive buildings. Look at these massive stones. And in that day, it wasn't just the beauty. It's like, look at this, what we have. We have the temple of God. The Jews do. This is going to be so wonderful when, again, you set up your kingdom and this temple is the center of everything. It's so magnificent. We've got God right here in this building. This magnificent building. And then what Jesus says, not one stone will be left on top of another. We read that. Stop and think about, what if someone said that about, again, Washington, D.C.? We're there like, look at this, the Capitol, wow, look at all these things. And someone says, yeah, not one stone's going to be left on top of another. Well, unless you rule out natural disasters, that's saying something's going to, it's not just that the building's going to be destroyed. They knew that means our whole system is going to be in upheaval. It means the whole thing's going to be turned upside down. It's not just the building, everything that building represents. That's what Jesus is saying. But the destruction of Jerusalem and the end, again, as Jesus talks about both of these things, he said, wherever the break is, if I'm right, if other people are right, if part of it's Jerusalem, part of it's end times, both of those confront this physical idea. Don't hold on to that temple. It's going down. And don't think this world is the focus. I'm coming back and setting up a whole nother world, a spiritual kingdom that even culminates more than this spiritual kingdom. He's confronting everything they're thinking. And so the root problem here, again, is this tendency we have to focus on the physical instead of the spiritual. And again, if you make those columns the physical, when I focus on that, who am I focused on? Focused on me, what I want. And when I'm focused on the spiritual, I'm focused on God and what He wants. And again, my religion, it may be, God, I love you. Again, the Facebook, well, share if you love God and you'll get something. That's a physical focus. It sounds godly. I love God. But it's all about me. I'll get what I want. And that's what he's saying to these disciples. You are so focused on the physical. You've got to get past this. And he's saying it to all of us to truly get it, what I intend and what I have in mind. Well, why do we struggle with that so much? And I think the reason is because we think... We see, and again, you could line them up, sight versus faith, physical, me, sight, spiritual, God, faith. You line it up, and it looks like my focus on the physical is the best thing for me. If I focus on the physical, again, throw God in to whatever degree, but I live my life with a focus on the physical, what I can see and me and what I need, that's the best life. At the end of it, that's going to be the best life. Well, to the degree we misunderstand the spiritual nature of the kingdom, we miss the kingdom. And some people are going to miss it entirely. A lot of people are just going to miss out on the abundance that God wants them to have. The peace, the lack of worry, the true joy, because we're focused on the wrong thing. Well, all right, how do we overcome it? What's the key to overcoming? And again, I need to have a spiritual focus, a focus on God, but how do I do that? And I think the answer is I need to trust. Again, it all lines up. Physical, me, sight, spiritual, God, faith, trust. I need to trust God. What's that look like? That means in the little things that come along. And God knows where you are. He's not going to put some challenge in front of you that's that you'll never be able to attain and be able to pass the test. It says He only, gives us situations that we can handle at the time. But He's going to give you a test of faith, and you're going to have the choice. Am I going to walk by faith or by sight? Am I going to do the thing that it looks like this would be best for me, or the thing that, God, I'm going to trust because you've said this is best? And you know what? You need to start small where you are, and God will give you something small. You need to start tangible. And I say that, and every time I say it, I hope you know, it's not to get more money, but when I say tangible, I'm talking about giving. Because it is so black and white, so dollars and cents. I give, and that's why the tithe. The tithe isn't commanded, but it's a pretty good standard of, wow, it's a step of faith to give 10%. Again, unless you're doing really, really well. And even those people struggle because usually how much money's enough? Just a little more. And so even for those people, 10% is a big chunk. But it's a good step of faith. Again, Lisa and I wouldn't be where we're at now if it wasn't for the times in the midst of really difficult financial times. We continued to give 10%. We saw God act, and now as we face other non-financial issues, we're like, well, he's shown us in that tangible, dollars and cents. He'll be with us now. Now, it doesn't mean there aren't the moments of I believe, help my unbelief, but down deep we know it. Well, what do I need to do now? You know, I had the thought as I was going through this preparation, you know, we need to ask ourselves, we've been talking about Jesus coming back. If I knew Jesus were coming tomorrow, if somehow I did know, and again, his whole point is you aren't going to know, so you need to live your whole life this way. But if I did know he was coming tomorrow, what would that change? And I don't want you to focus on that. Oh, I'd stop doing this and this. I'd start doing... It needs to be, where's my commitment now to him? What would I, as I look at my heart, what would I change? What would I do different in that sense? You know, again, the faith level, the commitment level, not the actions. They're a sign, and that's great. But my commitment to him, the way I approach a situation by faith or by sight, how would that change? And what will it look like when I do that? Well, I think there'll be less difference between what would it look like and what is. I would start living my life like, yeah, you know what? It's not just this could be the last day. It might not even, he may come before the end of this day. I'm going to live my entire life like Jesus could come before my next breath. That's what it would look like. And just think about that. That's the life he wants us to live. That's the life he promises, this abundance. I've come to give you not just life, but abundant life. And joy and peace. It can only come as we totally commit to him. Well, start to live it out. Again, bring it all to a close and discuss it a little bit. And I don't know, first of all, I thought of a question, maybe because I felt guilty for not having a question the past few weeks. And so I put one down, but then I thought with this sermon, maybe you'd rather just ask some questions or something like that, because I realize it's an intricate passage. But if you want to think about this, how does knowing what Jesus taught about the church age and his second coming affect how I live day to day? So again, a lot of people so focused on the end times, they forget, well, one, they don't even know we're in the end times, but what's it mean to my day-to-day life? To know what he said about what the church age is going to be like. To know what he said about, here I am going to come back and here's what it's going to be like. How does that affect you day to day? Or if you want, if you've got some questions, this is the time.